Oh, the focus of the article I wrote is not to speculate on why it's changing, but to document, I hope, exhaustively, that something has seriously gone wrong with Amnesty International. It has lost its way. Amnesty International has historically had a mixed record on the Israel-Palestine conflict. During the 1970s, it was very cautious in its criticism of Israel. And in the 1980s, to take the most obvious example, it's well documented that since the inception of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, since 1967, Israel practiced torture against Palestinian detainees. Now, Amnesty had some big campaigns to abolish torture. That was one of its, I think, decade campaigns in the 1980s. And when it came to Israel, they were very careful not to use the T word, the torture word. Things began to change in the late 1980s, in particular at the time of the First Intifada, when first of all Israel's torture practices became very widespread. The estimates are by Human Rights Watch that between 1987 and 1993, during the period of the First Intifada, Israel tortured probably around 20 to 30,000 Palestinian detainees. So it was now very difficult to conceal, to hide, to evade the reality of Israeli human rights violations. And secondly, some Israeli human rights organizations emerged, like B'Tselem, the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. And so now Amnesty could use B'Tselem to cite them, so as to say it's not us who are claiming Israel practices torture, or it's not only us, it's Israeli human rights organization. And I would say their record has been pretty good since the 1990s. During Operation Cast Lead in 2008, December 27th, 2007 to January 17th, 2008, during that, after the Israeli assault on Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, Amnesty put out a good report. It was titled 22 Days of Death and Destruction. And it was, I think, a fair but also courageous documentation of Israel's assault on Gaza. So we have basic data, basic raw numbers. So let's look at the basic raw data. There were 2,200 Palestinians killed, of whom approximately 70%, about 1,500, were civilians. In Israel, there were 73 Israelis killed, of whom only 6 were civilians, overwhelmingly combatants. In the case of Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. Children killed. 550 Palestinian children were killed. 1 Israeli child was killed. Ratio is pretty easy to figure out. Homes destroyed. Palestinian homes, 18,000 Palestinian homes were destroyed. Israel, 1 home destroyed. The ratio, again, is not difficult to figure out. It's 18,000 to 1. Take another number. At most, if you take the highest possible estimate, the Hamas rockets and mortar shells, they may have altogether come to about 35 to 70 tons of explosives. At most, I gave the maximum number. The current estimate for the explosives Israel dropped on Gaza was 20,000. I mean, these discrepancies are so vast. And yet, what did Amnesty do? It's kind of breathtaking. They produced 4 reports on war crimes and violations of human rights in Gaza. 2 of the reports criticized Israel. 2 of the reports criticized the Palestinians. So exactly balanced. But amazingly, if you look at the total number of pages, there were actually a significantly larger number of pages devoted to documenting Gazan war crimes as against Israeli war crimes. It was actually kind of bizarre what Amnesty did. You have to look at the facts. According to the UN, Hamas, I'm just using Hamas for all the armed militant groups. There's also obviously Islamic Jihad, and there are many others. I'll just call it, for simplicity's sake, I'll call it Hamas. Hamas fired 5,000 what are called rockets and 2,000 mortar shells at Israel. That's the UN figure. So altogether comes to 7,000. Okay? Now, we have to look at the results. 7,000 so-called rockets and mortar shells were fired at Israel. The results: 1 house destroyed, 6 civilians killed. Of those 6 civilians killed, incidentally, only 1 was killed by a so-called rocket. The other 5 were killed by mortar shells. So, what do you conclude about these rockets and mortar shells? They are basically enhanced fireworks. They're not real weapons. Some people will say, what about the Iron Dome anti-missile defense? Yeah. But there are many things to be said, and I'll try to keep myself brief. Number 1, the Iron Dome is alleged to have intercepted 735 rockets. In fact, the UN says it was 280 that were deflected. In fact, one of the leading anti-missile defense experts in the world, Theodore Postel at MIT, his estimate is about 40 Hamas so-called rockets were deflected. So, if you have 5,000 rockets, let's even accept the Israeli figure for which there's no evidence, but let's accept it. 735 were deflected. That still leaves 4,000. Using Israel's figures, that still leaves 4,000. How is it that 4,000 rockets, which were not intercepted, 1 house, how is that possible? Let's take another figure. There was no Iron Dome in the border areas, the Gaza border areas. The Iron Dome was in the major populated areas, not in the border areas. 2,600 of the 5,000 rockets and of the 7,000 rockets and mortars, 2,600 fell in the border areas. There was no Iron Dome. Still, 1 house destroyed. How do you explain that? You can maybe explain the limited civilian casualties as a result of what Israel's very effective civil warning and civil defense system. The mortar shells, not the rockets, the mortar shells did seem to inflict, I won't call it significant, but more damage on the Israeli army. For example, the estimate is, I think, 10 Israeli soldiers were killed in the border area from mortar shells. But there has to be some correspondence between a charge you are leveling and the kinds of death and destruction that are inflicted. Amnesty International says the rockets are indiscriminate weapons because they don't have a guidance system. They say the mortar shells are also indiscriminate in populated areas. So 7,000 rockets and mortar shells, according to Amnesty, each time you fire one
is a violation.
It's not just a violation, it's a war crime. So you have 7,000 war crimes for the 7,000 rockets and mortar shells. Then they say it's not only a war crime because the weapon is an indiscriminate weapon. So to make the long story short, you're getting thousands and thousands and thousands of war crimes, but at the end of the day, six civilians were killed and one house was destroyed. The rationale is they are trying to escalate, increase the number of Palestinian war crimes to balance it out with Israel. But you're doing it at the expense of rendering language not only meaningless, but observed. Thousands and thousands of war crimes and 6 civilians killed and 1 house destroyed. You're making the concept of war crime laughable. A travesty.
Yeah.
But that's what happens when, so I don't think they were compelled by professional responsibility to yield these conclusions. International law is unfortunately, it's infinitely flexible. So just to give you one example, one which I always liked, there was a judge on the International Court of Justice named Judge Viramantri. And in 1996, the case came before the International Court of Justice whether nuclear weapons were legal under international law. And the court couldn't decide. And Judge Viramantri, he said, there's something wrong here. How is it that the international community could decide in 1899 that a dum-dum bullet, one bullet, a dum-dum bullet is inhuman and has to be banned and declared illegal, but dropping 100 megaton bomb, which can incinerate a whole continent in the blink of an eye, we can't decide that that's illegal and inhuman and illegal under international law. So the court, the international law is sufficiently flexible that it can decide a dum-dum bullet is inhuman, but 100 megaton bomb, we're not sure.
Or a cruise missile.
No, Amnesty had room. I'll give you one example, just as a comparison. Hamas fired 1 rocket from Gaza. It fell short, fell into a playground. It killed 10 or more children. It was a disaster. It was a misfire which ended in a tragedy. Okay? Amnesty accuses Hamas, just for that one terrible incident, of 4 different war crimes. 4 different war crimes. They charged them with it being an indiscriminate attack. They charged it with being directed at civilian areas in Israel, even though it misfired and fell in Gaza. They said maybe it was fired from a residential area. No evidence, but they just throw in all of this. What I can say is they've done strange things in the past year. So let me give you one example. As you're well aware, Israel is creating a new hysteria about what they call a new anti-Semitism. There's no evidence whatsoever, none, of a new anti-Semitism. In the case of the United Kingdom, there have been several different polls taken. They all show the percentage of British citizens who harbor anti-Semitic sentiments. It's about 7 or 8%. If you look at anti-Roma, anti-Gypsy sentiment, it's like 60%. Anti-Muslim sentiment, about 40%. Anti-Semitic, it's not even barely registers on the radar screen. So what happens? Amnesty International puts forth this resolution that we should have a campaign in the United Kingdom against anti-Semitism. I mean, what kind of priority is that? The Advisory Council in the UK supported the resolution. The membership divided almost right down the middle, like 454, 450 against. So the resolution didn't pass. But the idea that such a preposterous resolution was even entertained, there is more prejudice against short people and fat people in the United Kingdom than there is against Jews. But that's true. I mean, you're laughing, but that's factually the case. There's more more prejudice against bald men than there is against Jews in the UK. So why is Amnesty why is Amnesty calling for a campaign against anti-Semitism? I think it speaks for itself. I don't have to speculate. And there's obviously pressures being exerted on Amnesty to prove it's even-handed, that is to say, to prove it's pro-Israel. I'm not addressing the question of whether or not it's right that these organizations command so much moral authority. I'm simply saying, as a factual matter, they do, and therefore we can't ignore them. We have to try to get them to do the right thing. And as I said, for 20 years, I think Amnesty's record since the early 1990s has been good. It's not been perfect, but nobody's perfect. Every major organization is subject to pressures. Its record has been good. Something went seriously wrong this past year, and we have to alert Amnesty and its base, its mass base of subscribers and supporters. Your organization is off course. So let me get back to the point you made earlier. Amnesty has declared all the rockets, so-called rockets, I don't think they're rockets, and all the rockets are illegal. All the mortar shells are illegal. The mere use of even one, according to them, is a war crime. Now, Amnesty also accuses Hamas of firing from civilian areas, which they say violates the international law provision, which requires an army or militants to take, the expression is, all feasible precautions to protect civilians. So, as you said, it's very hard to find areas in Gaza. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on the planet Earth. So what does Amnesty say? Amnesty says, I'm not making it up, I'm quoting them. They say there are a few areas in Gaza which are unpopulated, or not relatively unpopulated. You know, the equivalent of in New York, Central Park.
Yep.
So they say the militants should all go to these unpopulated areas
And stay there.
and fight from there.
So that they can be exterminated
Yeah.
together in one.
So they have to all go to these unpopulated areas. They can't fire any of their so-called rockets. They can't fire any of their so-called mortars. The only thing they didn't say is they should all line up like ducks and let the planes come. Again, for me, the issue is you have to, as a human rights organization, you have to make an argument that's morally compelling. So just as I said, it is not morally convincing to say that thousands and thousands and thousands of war crimes produce 6 civilian deaths and 1 home destroyed. It's also, to me, not morally convincing to say, here is a people that's lived under an occupation for nearly a half century. Number 2, they have lived under an illegal, immoral, and inhuman siege since 2007. Everybody agrees, including the new UN report. The new UN report, the Mary McGowan Davis report, it says Israel is still occupying Gaza.
Of course, yeah.
It also says the siege is, I'm using their words, strangling the economy of Gaza. It also says the siege has to be immediately and unconditionally lifted. That's the Mary McGowan Davis report, okay? So you have people living under a half-century occupation, a siege since 2007, which is illegal, and you're telling these people the only thing they have the right to do in the way of resistance to this illegal, immoral, and inhuman siege, the only thing they have the right to do is to go into a couple of unpopulated areas of Gaza, line up, they can't use any weapons, and they're just supposed to stand there and be shot down by Israel. Is that a morally compelling argument by a human rights organization? No. In my opinion, it does not convince. There were 1,000 tunnels going from Gaza to the Egyptian Sinai. Egypt sealed them from its side of the border. It didn't go into Gaza to seal the tunnels. Are you telling me that Israel doesn't have the technical know-how of Egypt? Are you telling me that the people of Gaza were able to dig deeper than an Israeli D9 bulldozer? Are you telling me Israel couldn't just bulldoze a trench along its border and flood all the tunnels? They had an easy option. Every single encounter between Hamas militants and Israelis, or militants entering through the tunnels, it was only combatants that the militants came into firefights with. They were right in the civilian areas. They were not targeting civilians. The Mary McGowan Davis report says that. It says all the incidents that have been reported.
So they were careful not to
exactly
target the civilians.
They were not targeting civilians. There were infiltrations, correct. They came up in civilian areas, correct. They came out, the Hamas militants who infiltrated, and only targeted combatants. That's in the Mary McGowan Davis report. So all of the claims about this threat that Hamas posed to Israel, it's just not true. And Amnesty escalates this. I'll give you an example. As I'm sure you're aware, every Israel propaganda piece of Israeli propaganda, they always talk about these Hamas rockets, the Al-Fajr rocket, the this rocket, the Iranian rocket, and they always make it sound so, this huge arsenal of rockets. And they have the pictures, you know, this rocket and this rocket and this rocket. But you search very hard, and believe me, I searched. You search very hard about what was the Israeli arsenal that was used against Gaza.
You will not find it.
Well, it's very hard to find. I searched hard. Let me give you an example. 5,000 so-called rockets, 2,000 mortar shells, okay? Altogether 7,000. Just artillery shells, Israel fired 20,000 high explosive artillery shells into Gaza. Now remember, artillery shells is not the fancy part of the Israeli arsenal. We're just taking the artillery shells, 155 millimeter shells, 20,000. Do the math. That's 3 times the total Hamas arsenal of rockets and mortar shells that were fired into Israel. They fired 14,500 tank shells. Nobody has yet calculated the bomb tonnage that was dropped on Gaza. But here is an example, one example. In Shujaya, they dropped over 100. Shujaya is just a small little place.
Area, yes.
100, over 100, I saw one estimate of 120, 2,000 pound, over 100 one-ton bombs just on Shujaya. And they fired in Shujaya 600 high explosive artillery shells. I mean, more was dropped on Shujaya than the whole Hamas arsenal. It's so farcical, the claims that are being made. It was more than propaganda. It's a moral scandal when you consider. I want to just give one other example, which nobody has mentioned. I have read every human rights report on Operation Protective Edge. I've actually read, and it's almost embarrassing, I've read the UN reports, 183 pages, single-spaced. I've already read it 3 times. I'm just going through it like very carefully. Yeah, well, I know it. I want to just give you one example. You go through every report. You do it yourself. Do a little test yourself. Not one report has said anything about the fact 70 mosques in Gaza were destroyed. 130 others were damaged. Now you ask yourself, if one synagogue in Israel had been hit by a rocket attack, the New York Times wouldn't be able even to find a font large enough for its headline, a synagogue being hit. Not one human rights report devoted any space to the targeting of the mosques. It's so shameful, such a moral disgrace not to even mention it, except to say Israel said Hamas fighters were stashing weapons in mosques, Hamas fighters were using mosques to launch rockets, but to actually examine 70 mosques. Could you imagine 70 synagogues? They would be calling it Kristallnacht, you know, after what happened in the Nazis. You know, nothing. Amnesty devotes a whole report to the collaborators and so-called collaborators who were killed by Hamas. Okay, I don't approve of it. I can't support it, though I can understand in the circumstances it becomes very tough because you have all these people working for the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is passing on information to Israel to target places in Gaza. Collaborators are a problem. But the way it was done in Gaza, it was unacceptable in my opinion, because what they did was they took the collaborators who were already arrested and in jail, they took them out of jail and lined them up and shot them down to send a message. If you're a collaborator, this is the fate that awaits you. I can't support that. But it does bother me that they give a higher priority to the collaborators than they do to 200, I think it was 210 mosques, which were either destroyed or damaged, and nothing. The Mary McGowan Davis, look, it's 183 pages. Look for a heading for mosques. Nothing. The other thing, here the has been okay, but it still merits being mentioned. The number of ambulances they target, the Israelis. And even there, Human Rights Watch is commenting that they just routinely target ambulances. What's interesting with Israel is, to me it's just really kind of shocking. They don't even make an effort to prove, their usual proofs, but they don't even make an effort to prove the ambulances are being used by Hamas. They don't. They provided this time one 24-second video of two Hamas members and a driver entering a military ambulance who were apparently just on their way to a normal rescue operation, because Hamas, like every military organization, has its own ambulatory service for dangerous missions. That's the only proof they put. And they targeted, this time 16 ambulances, killed the staff. I mean, the courage it takes, the commitment it takes for a doctor or a doctor's assistant to go into a war zone to try to rescue someone. In 2012, the Muslim Brotherhood was in power in Egypt. President Morsi, both Turkey and Egypt made clear to the United States that we have our red lines and that Israel cannot do another Operation Cast Lead.
2014, there was none of that.
2014, Sisi's in power in Egypt, supporting Israel's attack on Hamas. Turkey is preoccupied with Syria, doesn't care much about Gaza. Saudi Arabia is openly supporting Israel. The Arab League is supporting Israel. It came before the Gaza attack was only once discussed in the Arab League. The Arab League endorsed the Sisi-Israeli ceasefire proposal, which was a complete betrayal of the people of Gaza. It is true that after Cast Lead, they were worried, but then they managed to kill the Goldstone report, and now the new report, the Mary McGowan Davis, it's just, believe me, the new UN report, it could have been written by a computer. It has no human emotion in it. It's just, it's so
Setting
wooden,
mere facts.
leaden, and in many cases, it's just a completely, it's so ridiculous, the report, that you try to imagine what kind of mind could have sat down to produce some of the sentences in the report.